The morning I sold my company, I stood in a parking garage in downtown Columbus and cried for 10 minutes before I could drive home. Not because I was sad, because I was 63 years old, and I had just signed papers that transferred 31 years of my life, every late night, every skipped vacation, every birthday dinner I showed up to distracted, into a wire transfer of $42 million. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I sat in my truck, a 2019 F-150 that I still drove because it ran fine, and I never saw the point in replacing things that worked, and I stared at the concrete wall in front of me until the shaking stopped. I called nobody. There was nobody to call. That's the part people don't understand when they hear a story like this. They imagine champagne. They imagine a family gathering around a table, everybody hugging, somebody crying happy tears. What they don't picture is a man sitting alone in a parking garage at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, realizing that the only person who would have wanted to hear this news, my son Wesley, hadn't spoken to me in 11 years. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I started Caldwell Thermal Solutions out of my garage in 1992. Industrial HVAC systems for large commercial buildings, not glamorous, not the kind of thing that gets you written up in magazines. But it was mine. I built it with a second mortgage on the house, a used van, and a contract with a strip mall developer in Westerville who gave me a shot because nobody else would return his calls. By 2005, we had 40 employees. By 2015, over 200. When a private equity firm out of Chicago approached me in early 2023, I knew it was time. My knees hurt. My lower back had been talking to me since 2018, and frankly, the industry was changing in ways that needed younger energy than I had left. During those 31 years, my son Wesley grew up, went to college, married a woman named Renata. Wait, no, her name was Simone. Married Simone, had 2 kids I'd never met, and somewhere along the way decided that I wasn't worth the effort of a phone call. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about family estrangement. It's not usually a door slamming. It's a door that slowly, quietly closes, and by the time you notice the draft, it's already latched. After his mother and I divorced in 2007, Wesley was 22. Old enough that the courts weren't involved, old enough to make his own choices. He chose his mother's version of events, which was that I had been absent and cold and more married to my company than to my family. Some of that was true. I won't pretend otherwise. But I also coached his little league team for 6 years. I drove him to every saxophone lesson from 5th grade through junior year. When he got a girl pregnant at 19, I was the one who sat with him at the kitchen table at midnight, not yelling, just talking through what responsibility looked like. None of that made it into her version. The calls thinned out after the divorce. Then they stopped. I sent birthday cards for years. Actual cards, handwritten, sometimes with a check he may or may not have cashed. I stopped sending the checks after a while because it felt like I was trying to buy something that should have been free. I kept sending the cards until 2015, when one came back stamped with a new address sticker that just said "Return to sender." Not at this address. He hadn't told me he moved. That was the day I understood that this wasn't drifting. This was chosen. I built a life around the absence. I bought a condo in a good neighborhood in Dublin, Ohio, just outside Columbus. I had friends from the Rotary Club, a poker group that met every other Thursday, and a woman named Diane. No, she's in the list. A woman I'd been seeing quietly for about 2 years. A retired school teacher named Agatha, who liked hiking and bad science fiction movies, and who never once made me feel like I owed her anything. It wasn't a large life, but it was honest, and it was mine, and I had stopped expecting it to be otherwise. Then came the Tuesday in the parking garage. I moved quickly after the sale closed, not impulsively. I'd planned it. I'd always wanted to live somewhere with actual seasons. That didn't also mean shoveling a driveway. And I'd had my eye on a craftsman-style house in Asheville, North Carolina for about 6 months. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, half an acre of yard backing up to a creek. I bought it for just under $1.2 million, paid cash, and drove down in October with 2 suitcases and my fishing gear. The rest of my stuff came in a moving truck 3 days later. I didn't announce the move publicly. I forwarded my mail, told the post office, gave my new address to my accountant and my attorney, and to Agatha, who I was still talking to long distance. I didn't post on Facebook. I didn't have Instagram. I was 63 years old, and I had just sold a company and moved to the mountains, and the last thing I wanted was noise. For 4 months, I was quieter than I had been since I was a child. I took long walks. I cooked real meals, not the frozen things I'd been eating in Columbus. I got to know my neighbors, a retired Marine named Bert, 2 doors down, and an older black couple across the street who'd lived in that house since 1987 and who brought me pound cake the first week I arrived like it was still 1955. I started sleeping through the night. I was standing on my porch one February morning, coffee in hand, watching a pair of cardinals in the dogwood tree at the edge of the property, when a car I didn't recognize turned slowly onto my street. I noticed it because it moved too carefully. People who know a neighborhood don't drive that way. People who are looking for a specific address do. It pulled into my driveway. The doors opened, and I felt the coffee cup go still in my hand. Wesley got out first. He was 40 now, heavier than I remembered, with a beard that was going gray at the chin. He was wearing a North Face jacket, and he had the slightly uncertain look of someone who has rehearsed something and is now hoping they still remember their lines. Behind him came Simone. She was small and dark-haired, and she walked with a directness that I had noticed, even from photographs Wesley had been tagged in online years ago, that I had always associated with a certain kind of person who has decided exactly what they want, and is simply working out the logistics of getting it. And behind Simone came a man I didn't know, and a woman who must have been Simone's mother. They were pulling rolling suitcases. Plural. Like they were checking into a hotel. I set my coffee cup down on the porch railing. Slowly, Wesley said, "Dad, just that. One word, like it was enough. Like 11 years could be covered by 4 letters and a breath of cold February mountain air." I said, "Wesley." He came up the porch steps and hugged me. And I let him, because whatever else was happening, whatever this was, he was still my son, and I had missed him with a grief that had never fully named itself. But even as I held him, I was watching Simone, over his shoulder, watching the way she was looking at the house, at the porch, at the yard, running some kind of internal calculation I couldn't quite read. I could guess at it, though. "Why don't you come inside?" I said, because it was February, and because I needed a moment to think. The man with the suitcase introduced himself as Simone's stepfather, a big man with a too-firm handshake, and the specific confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether he was welcome somewhere. His name was Dax. I want you to understand what Dax was like within roughly the first 90 seconds. He walked into my house, looked around with his hands in his jacket pockets, and said, "Nice place. Lot of square footage for one person. Not hello, not thank you for having us. Nice place. Lot of square footage for one person." Simone's mother introduced herself as Patrice. She was quieter, but she went directly to the kitchen and opened my refrigerator to look inside, the way you do in a house where you already belong. I stood in my own living room and watched the 4 of them spread out like something spilled, and I thought, I need to call my attorney. But first, I needed to understand the situation. And I needed Wesley to look at me like he used to, like a son talking to his father, so I could get some reading on what was real. I made coffee. It was the only thing I could think of to do with my hands. Wesley sat at the kitchen table and talked. He talked about the last 11 years in the way people do when they're summarizing a film for someone who hasn't seen it. Enough to establish the plot, not enough to give anything real away. He'd been in and out of work. There had been some money troubles. The kids, I had 2 grandchildren, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, were in school back in Cincinnati. He and Simone had been renting a place that was getting complicated. He'd seen the news about Caldwell. I hadn't announced it publicly, but there had been a brief mention in a Columbus business journal, and someone had apparently seen it, and sent it to someone who sent it to someone who told Wesley. I sat across from him and I thought, the address. He'd found my address the same way. The business journal mention had my attorney's office listed as the point of contact. Wesley knew my old attorney, who had an assistant who probably shouldn't have said anything but apparently had. That explained it, and it explained the suitcases. Dax came back into the kitchen at that point and sat down without being invited, the way he'd done everything since walking through my front door. He poured himself coffee from the pot I'd made, which was a small thing but also not a small thing. He said, "I'll be straight with you, Martin. Wesley's told us about the sale. We're not here to mess around. Family takes care of family. We're thinking this place has more than enough room, and getting the band back together makes sense for everybody." I looked at him. He held my gaze with the particular expression of a man who has won arguments by not blinking. I said, "I'm sorry, Dax, was it? I didn't catch the part where you and I became family." A small silence. Simone put her hand on her husband's arm. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Part apology, part warning directed at someone, possibly me, possibly Dax, and said, "What we mean, Martin, is that things have been hard. Wesley has really missed you. We all have. And we thought, now that you have this beautiful place, maybe we could spend some time together and figure out what the future looks like for all of us." The future for all of us. She said it with a warmth that was almost real. I looked at Wesley, who was looking at the table. "How long are you planning to stay?" I asked. Nobody answered directly. Patrice refilled her coffee cup. Dax said something about how these things were fluid. Wesley finally looked up and said, "We don't want to impose." The rolling suitcases were in my front hallway. 3 weeks later, I understood that I had made a mistake in not ending it that first afternoon. Not because I had given them an inch, though I had, but because that inch had been interpreted as a mile, a marathon, and a deed of property. Dax had established himself as a kind of informal household manager, which meant he had opinions about everything and authority over nothing, but behaved as though the distinction didn't apply to him. He rearranged my garage to make better use of the space, without asking. He invited a friend of his to come watch a football game at my house, a man I had never met, sitting in my living room, eating my food, calling me chief. When I pointed out that I would have appreciated being consulted, Dax looked at me with genuine puzzlement, like I had brought up something philosophical. Simone was more sophisticated about it. She talked about the grandchildren constantly, how much they missed their grandfather, how important it was for the kids to have a strong male presence, how a house this size was really meant for a family. She would say these things while looking around the room with a quiet acquisitiveness that she didn't bother to fully conceal, because I think on some level she had already decided that I wasn't paying close enough attention to catch it. She was miscalculating. Wesley, my son, the one I had actually driven across state lines to see in a Little League tournament he didn't know I came to because I stood at the edge of the parking lot and watched from a distance because I hadn't been invited. Wesley spent most of his time on his phone or sleeping until 10. We had 2 real conversations in 3 weeks. In one of them, late at night when the others had gone to bed and we were sitting in the kitchen with the last of a bottle of bourbon between us, he told me he was sorry. He said it simply, without theater, and I believed him. But sorry is a beginning, not a resolution, and a beginning that comes with suitcases and a stepfather-in-law who rearranges your garage is a complicated place to start. I called my attorney, a sharp woman in Columbus named Ms. Aldridge, who had handled the sale and who I had by this point given a very precise summary of my situation. She told me what I already suspected, that having them in my home for over 3 weeks, in some states could begin to create a tenant relationship with legal implications for removal. North Carolina has specific provisions. I needed to act. I also called my accountant. I had some arrangements to make. That Saturday morning I woke up early, made a full breakfast, eggs, toast, real orange juice, the kind of breakfast I hadn't made in years, and set the table for 5. When they all came downstairs, drawn by the smell of coffee, I asked them to sit down. Dax tried to take the seat at the head of the table. I was already in it. He sat at the side without commenting. I let everyone get their food. Then I said, I need to say something, and I'd appreciate it if everyone let me finish before responding. Simone set down her orange juice. Wesley looked up. I said, I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what this is, and I've decided to stop wondering and just name it. You came here because of the sale. I understand that. I'm not angry about it. It's human. But this house isn't a family compound, and I'm not a resource to be organized around. I love my son. That is separate from what I'm about to say. Dax started to say something. I held up one hand, the same hand I'd used to run 200 people for 15 years. And he stopped. I've spoken with my attorney. You have 2 weeks to make other arrangements. I'm not going to make this ugly. I have no interest in calling anyone or creating a scene. But in 14 days, I need my home back. The silence had weight to it. Patrice, who had barely spoken in 3 weeks, stood up quietly and went upstairs. I think she had understood something before the others did. Dax started in. The word family came up several times, and the phrase after everything, which I found interesting given that he and I had been in the same room for approximately 22 days of our respective lives. Simone tried a softer approach, mentioning the grandchildren twice in 3 sentences. Wesley said nothing. He was looking at his plate. When Dax finished, I said, I hear you. 2 weeks. Then I poured myself more coffee. What I hadn't mentioned at the table was the other call I'd made that week, to a financial advisor in Asheville who came highly recommended, a quiet man named Everett. No, he's in the list. A quiet man named Curtis, who had been helping me structure a philanthropic trust I'd been thinking about since before the sale even closed. The Caldwell Family Foundation, the name was the only thing I'd kept, was going to fund scholarships for vocational and trade students in central Ohio. HVAC, electrical, plumbing, the trades that had given me my life. The fund was going to be substantial. Wesley found out about it 4 days before his 2 weeks were up. I don't know how. Perhaps he'd been paying more attention to my mail than I'd realized. Or perhaps he overheard a phone call. He came to find me on the back porch, where I was reading, and he sat in the chair beside me without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "The foundation. You set it up already?" "Yes, there's nothing in there for—" He stopped. "For you?" I said. Not unkindly. Just the question. He looked out at the creek. A heron was standing in the shallow end, very still the way they do. "I was going to put things right," he said. "That's why I came." "I know that's part of it," I said, "and I believe the other part too. That you miss me, I missed you. That's not nothing, Wesley. That matters to me. But," he said, "but I'm 63 years old, and I'm not going to pretend that showing up with Dax in a set of rolling suitcases is the same as reaching out. Those are different things." He nodded slowly. The heron lifted off the creek and disappeared into the tree line. "What do I do?" he said. "You go home," I said. "You and Simone go home to your kids, and you figure out your finances. And you do that without me underwriting it. And maybe in 6 months or a year you call me, not because you need something, just to call." He left the next morning. Just him and Simone. Dax and Patrice had packed up 2 days earlier without ceremony, which told me what I needed to know about Dax's commitment to the project. The house was quiet again. I washed the guest linens, put them back in the closet, and opened the windows because February had turned into a cool but tentative March, and the air off the creek smelled like something beginning. I called Agatha that afternoon. She was driving back from a hiking trip in the Smokies, and she answered on the third ring, and when I told her the whole story, the parking garage, the cardinals, the rolling suitcases, Dax at the head of my table, she laughed until she had to pull over. Not at me, with me. That was the thing about Agatha. She always laughed at the right things. I got a postcard from Wesley in April. Just a postcard, the old-fashioned kind, a picture of the Cincinnati skyline. On the back it said, "We got an apartment in Hyde Park. Kids are doing well. I think about what you said. W." I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of North Carolina. The Foundation's first scholarship class, 14 young men and women from Central Ohio, enrolled in technical programs at Columbus State and Tri-C, was announced in June. I drove back for the small ceremony. I shook 14 hands. One of them reminded me of myself at 20. Serious eyes, a firm grip, a little scared in the way you need to be to take something seriously. I didn't make a speech. I just told them. The trades built this country, and the trades built me, and I hoped they'd find in their work what I had found in mine. Not just money, though money matters, but the specific satisfaction of making something that functions, that holds, that outlasts the person who made it. I drove home to Asheville that evening. My porch, my creek, my cardinals, if they happened to be around. They were.